why don't we do this? We'll get started. So I will say hello and welcome everybody. My name is Maron, and this is a Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism webinar. It is the Parents' Rights webinar, and we have some amazing panelists that I'm going to introduce to you all in a moment. We're going to be discussing what you can do, the various things you can do as a parent to protect your children in the K-12 school setting. And one of the most important things you can do is know what your rights are as parents. I'm here in New York, and we have a New York heavy panel, but we have Candice checking in from California. So it's not all New York. And this is really, we're going to touch on both federal law in terms of the rights that parents have and also local activism. In terms of a little bit of housekeeping, this webinar is being recorded. So you will be able to watch it again later or share it with friends if you find it interesting. And we are going to take questions and answer questions and hopefully provide you answers towards the end of the webinar. And the way to do that is the question and answer function. We won't necessarily be able to keep up with all of the chat. So there's a question and answer function, and you can put in the question, and we will get to as many of those as we can at the end. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves more fully and give you some of their background about what led them to become sort of active champions of parent rights in the school setting. But let me now welcome our panelists. We have Yiatin Chu, who is a FAIR advisor and the co-president of Place NYC, which is a parent advocacy group here in New York. Yiatin and I are both co-founders of that group. Yiatin is a New York City public school graduate and the mom of 2 New York City public school students. And she's really been instrumental in changing the makeup of the board in the recent New York City school board elections, and has also worked on Asian American advocacy issues in education and more broadly in our city. Mona Davids is the president of Social Impact Strategies and the founder of the New York City Parents Union. Like Yiatin, she is a graduate of public schools and the mother of 2 children who have been in and are currently in New York City public schools. Over the last decade, Mona has taken on the teachers union and successfully sued the New York City Department of Education, the New York State Department of Education, the former mayor, Michael Bloomberg, and the soon-to-be former mayor, Bill de Blasio, as well as our former governor, Cuomo. And she's going to tell us about some of that activism and some of the results there. Candice Jackson also joins us, and she served as the acting assistant secretary for civil rights and then the deputy general counsel in the U.S. Department of Education from April 2017 to January 2021. She and her wife and their twins live in California, as I mentioned, and Candice is now in private law practice after having been at the U.S. Department of Education. And Candice is going to talk to us about really the deterioration in parents' rights in the education system and sort of the trend of replacing education with ideology. And that's going to be a big part of our discussion. So I'm looking forward to that. What I thought we would do, and I mentioned this already to our panelists, but I'm the moderator, I'm Maud Maron. I'm going to walk us through some questions, but I really hope that the panelists can also communicate with each other. So if they have anything to say, as I'm sure you all will, to each other about these important topics, please jump in. So Candice, I wanted to start with you, since you've worked in the U.S. Department of Education. Can you tell us what led you to working in that role in the Department of Education and what your experience there taught you to look out for as a parent of school-age children?
Sure. Well, thank you, Maud. It's a pleasure to be here with FAIR tonight in this important topic that is really, thankfully, I think, sweeping the nation right now, as it should. It seems like there's been several strands of tension and pressure placed on parents and schools and students over the last couple of years that has really, I think the upside is that it's really brought to the forefront a renewed apolitical, non-political interest in parents' rights to be involved and what kinds of options and choices that they have. serving in the U.S. Education Department from 2017 to the change of the administration in January was an interesting time, right? Because the coronavirus, the pandemic, that impact on the dynamic of how parents were interacting with schools, what parents' expectations were of schools, what the federal government's role versus the state's role, that created new dynamics that nobody in government had really had to deal with before. Going into the education department to begin with, for me, I saw the change of administration in 2017 to be an opportunity where, frankly, a lot of outsiders, a lot of non-government establishment, career, political types were being invited in. So I took the opportunity to join Secretary DeVos and President Trump in helping education freedom would be kind of the motif, I think, of that administration's approach to education, and to help widen the conversation about the kind of control that parents and families should have over where their kids go to school, what they're exposed to in school, and the realities of how that works became very clear right away. You know it, but it's different to see it up close. The strange way that, on the one hand, the federal government plays very little role in education, all in all. For K through 12, the federal government contributes maybe 10% of funding. And there is actually a longstanding federal law, the General Education Provisions Act, that expressly forbids the federal government from being involved in school curriculum. No control or direction by federal officials over school curriculum. So the role of the federal government in the content of education is designed to be very limited. On the other hand, we all know and can see, it's palpable, that the federal government has tremendous influence over how public schools are run in this country. And interestingly, when I went into the education department and spent my first 14, 15 months there running the civil rights department, which was the most interesting area for me, because that's where the federal government does gain some control over education, even straying into content, because the premise being that in order to accept any kind of federal funding, schools are going to be on the hook for upholding non-discrimination statutes. We have Title IX that forbids discrimination in education programs or activities on the basis of sex. The 1964 Civil Rights Act does the same for under Title VI as to race and national origin. The ADA and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act do the same with respect to disability. So there are these non-discrimination mandates that apply federally, and that's the hook. That's the reason why you do see a ton of pressure from the federal government and the federal education department dictating and structuring how schools have to run things. So I'll stop there for now. So it's great to be part of this discussion.
Great. That's a great overview. Thank you. And let me ask you, sort of as a very specific follow-up, and I know this is given that states have the lion's share of responsibility when it comes to education, and their education is embedded in our states' constitutions throughout the country. But there is federal legislation that's specific as to parent rights, and what rights do parents have concerning their children's education that are based in federal law?
Yeah, that's a great question, and in this current time, in this current moment, parents should be aware that there are some important federal rights to be aware of. Start with our federal Constitution. The word parents doesn't appear in it, but so when you hear something like the liberty of parents to direct the upbringing, education, and care of their children is a fundamental right. All right, that doesn't actually appear in the Constitution. That's actually a language from a parental rights amendment that's been introduced in Congress and hasn't gone anywhere. That has been in reaction to the fact that for about a century or more, the US Supreme Court recognized, even though it's not an enumerated right, did recognize a fundamental right of parents to control and direct their children's education. Things took a bit of a turn around the year 2000 with a particular case that ended up lowering, in effect anyway, lowering the standard of review by the federal courts and leaving a lot more up to states in terms of how much involvement and rights parents had over the direction of their child's education and other aspects of their well-being. And so one of the impacts of that for about the last 20 years has been to leave a lot of discretion to the states and to somewhat take parental rights out of a fundamental rights framework and turn it more into a judge by judge, case by case. We're going to balance parental rights against our view of what's in the best interest of the child. That has lots of ramifications for parental rights. So there is a federal constitutional fundamental right. It's not as strong as it has been in the past or as it probably could or should be. There are a couple of federal education statutes that parents probably don't work with or interact with very much, but in this day and age, when the push for parental rights is especially concerned with the content and concerns about ideology and kind of indoctrination rather than education, a couple of statutes that can become at least tools in a parent's toolbox.
So let's talk about one in particular, Candice, because we sent a letter that we're going to talk about as a parental tool a little bit later. But in that letter, we reference the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment, which has great language in it that I had never read before and wasn't familiar with, despite being on my school board and despite being very involved in education, because it's not something I think a lot of parents spend a lot of time talking about or knowing about. So
it's a very good procedural right for parents to keep in mind. It says that if a K-12 school is going to implement any survey, analysis, or evaluation that interrogates or asks a kid to discuss or reveal or talk about any of several enumerated topics, then the parents have the right to consent to that, and specifically the right to be notified in advance and opt out of that. And the specific things that these surveys or evaluations can be about that would trigger this right are political affiliation, mental or psychological problems, sex behavior and attitudes. And I have a feeling we'll talk a little bit about how that might be relevant these days. And then there are a few more that aren't so relevant probably to what we're talking about. And then there's a little bit of a catch-all that's any illegal, antisocial, self-incriminatory, or demeaning behavior. And all of these topics it's asking kids about themselves or about their families. So that can trigger their parents' right to be notified and opt out. Really quickly, FERPA, the Family Educational Privacy Rights Act, also gives parents of any student who is under age 18 or not in college yet the right to access, inspect, and review their students' education records. And again, in this day and age, with some of the specific issues that are going on, another important right under FERPA is not only do you get to inspect and review your child's school records, but you also have the right to demand corrections and to leave statements in your kid's school records if the school goes through a hearing process and denies you the correction. So it's those the PPRA and FERPA are kind of dry, technical, procedural, but they are tools in a parent's toolbox.
They certainly are. And when we come a little later to talk, we reference both of those acts in the letter that we've shared with, and that will also be made available when we post this webinar on the FAIR website. But it's great reading. If you're a parent who's worried about what's going on in your schools, it's really nice to know that you have the right as a parent to be notified about the sort of things that I think we all know has been, going, or for many of us parents, I should say, we've been sort of concerned about, or I'll just say that I've been concerned about, and I know other parents have been concerned about, that seem invasive of our children's privacy. Let me turn. So thank you about that. And let's put a pin in it for a moment, because I want to come back to it, and I want to cover, it's a great place to start with the overarching sort of federal law and the rights that we have as parents. But I want to also just talk about the more everyday issues that we face as parents. And because this is also something that we hear a lot here in New York City, and I have heard a lot from parents around the country. I was in DC at a parents' rights rally 2 days ago, and I was talking to parents from Virginia and from Florida and from Rhode Island and from Oregon. And so I know that these issues are not unique to New York. And one of the things that I kept hearing about from parents, and Mona, I'm going to ask you about this, is this real active effort to remove school resource officers. In New York, we call them school safety agents, from schools. A lot of times you hear from an activist perspective that this is part of a school to prison pipeline, and that this is cops in schools, and that it's, sometimes there's a discussion of it being racially based. But we have heard from a lot of parents who are really unhappy with that, with the politics around trying to remove school safety agents here in New York and school resource officers elsewhere. Mona, what have you seen in terms of how parents who want to keep school safety agents in their schools, how can they successfully fight to either keep them or bring them back?
Well, it's interesting, and I know that this is a national discussion, but I'm going to just focus a little bit on New York City. So in New York City, we have school safety agents. The majority of our school safety agents are women. 70% of them are women, and they're Black, Hispanic, and Asian women. And our school safety agents in New York City are civil servants. They take a civil service exam. So unlike in the rest of the country, where you have resource officers who are police officers, who are armed, who carry firearms, New York City's school safety agents, and again, these are majority mothers and grandmothers from our community, they are civil servants. And it's been unfortunate that with this whole defund the police or abolish the police, this movement of, I just call them anarchists, that are saying, oh, well, we need to get rid of the police. Unfortunately, in New York City, our woke politicians and the progressives and the socialists, and as I call them, the crazies, have said that one of the first things to be removed should be police in our schools. And if you've been watching, whether it's New York City news or even national news, we are constantly finding weapons in our schools, finding weapons, we're finding knives, we're finding brass knuckles. I mean, ice picks, everything, you name it. Our schools are dangerous. And then in addition to that, most of our communities are under siege with gun violence. And when I say most of New York City communities, listen, it could be from the South Bronx to the Upper West Side. Even the Upper West Side, in front of an elementary, in front of a private elementary school, there was a street shootout. So these are not, isolated incidents in Black and Hispanic communities. This is now citywide. So with our school safety agents, for parents, we want them in the schools. But what's happened is the politicians, or the so-called woke politicians, are very sneaky. So they try to have a city council hearing so that they can completely remove the school safety agents. They didn't notify parents. No parents were invited. And, Maud and Yiatin are here. Like, we always get invited to city council hearings on education. I don't think any of us got the invitation to that one. And, they do it and they don't consult us. It's like they circumvent our rights as parents. They circumvent us when it comes to, what we want our children to learn. They circumvent us when it comes to also the safety of our children. New York City public school parents, listen, we want school safety agents because we do not want a child to die in our schools. We don't want our child to be stabbed in our schools. These women, these mothers, these mama bears keep our children safe in our schools. And then I just want to add something because, for me, yes, my children have attended charter schools. My children have attended public schools. I believe in parent empowerment. I believe in parents having a seat at the education policy table to be equal with the school district and the teachers union and the principals union, because we are the real stakeholders. And when it comes to, what this situation with, school safety, I want to point out something. Again, for me, I don't care whether your child attends a private school, madrasa, yeshiva, magnet, specialized community, it doesn't matter. Every parent should have a say in their child's education and in what goes on in the school. And when it comes to school safety, what bothers me the most is, and I'm going to point this out, earlier in the spring, a young man, Devontae Lewis, was shot and killed at dismissal in Brooklyn in front of He's Charter School. Now, He's Charter School is located in a private building. Most New York City charter schools are co-located. And this is how hypocritical these politicians are and how much they do not care about our children. Because he was in a private charter schools, privately located charter schools do not have security. The schools have to pay for security. But our woke left city council members passed legislation to pay for private security for private schools, madrasas, yeshivas, but they refuse to include those charter schools that are privately located, including like my son's school. And because of that, because that school didn't have security, at dismissal at 2:45 in the afternoon, these kids walked up to this young man and shot him dead in the chest. So this is what we have to deal with. And this is why it's really critical that parents get involved. Don't just get involved when it comes to education. Don't just get involved when it comes to safety. Don't just get involved when it comes to health-related concerns like what we have with COVID and vaccines and mandates and masks. You need to get involved with everything related to your child's education and to the school. Don't say I only support one issue, but I'm not going to bother with the other issue, because it's all connected.
Mona, you bring up a really good point about the legislation, because if you're a parent who's going to school board meetings, that issue of whether or not security officers and are being, provided to non-public schools, whether it's private schools and not charter schools, that you're only going to find in a city legislative or a state legislative level. So a lot of the education activism that we've seen has been not at the school board. Plenty of activism at the school board too, but to really understand what's going on, you have to, as a parent activist, start to get involved with some of your local politicians, because that's where the devil is in the details with the legislation that we see coming on both a local, in New York City, a local, but on a state level around education issues. And that's sort of the perfect segue to ask Yiatin to let us know, because Yiatin has done a lot of work in terms of working with working with or working against. I don't know which is more accurate with local politicians. So Yiatin, can you tell us how you became an education advocate and what led you and others to form Place NYC?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here this evening with my fellow panelists and to be on this fair webinar. I see we have a fairly packed room in terms of attendees. How did I become a parent activist? Accidentally, really. I had a very private life as a working mom in Manhattan, and I transferred my second grader at the time to a new school. And there I met parents that were already activated based on what was happening to our New York City specialized high schools. So I was asked to speak on some parents' behalf at a Senate hearing here in New York City. And that was my first time, and a very public one, as a step into education advocacy. And for those of you who don't know about the New York City specialized high schools, these are high schools that admit students based on a single test called the SHSAT. And the reason why these schools became not just New York big news, but also on the national level is that these schools were targeted for an overhaul because they were majority Asian students. And there are very few Black and Hispanic students that are being admitted to the specialized high school. Of course, as an alumna of one of these specialized high schools, that was not the case in the 80s. So it really got me looking at what happened in the last 30 years in New York City education, and found out that the scarcity of gifted and talented programs, especially in Black and Hispanic neighborhoods in New York City, and also as part of a national detracking movement, really impacted what we call the pipeline of students into these strong academic STEM-focused high schools. So really, how did this bring me to form Place along with other parent leaders? Well, de Blasio, for the last few years, had appointed a group that's called the School Diversity Advisory Group. And that group was asked to look at, opportunities for integration within our New York City public school system. And in August of 2019, which seems like so long ago, but the SDAG for short issued their kind of final recommendation. And their recommendation to advance school integration was to eliminate New York City's gifted and talented programs. Now, mind you, these programs take in about 2,500 students, which is about 4% of each year's students into these programs. So it's a very, very small fraction, and it boggles my mind as far as the math goes, how that would really make a big impact in terms of what they were trying to achieve. But why do we form Place NYC? Well, unlike the specialized high schools where there are just 8, with the gifted and talented programs, there are 5 citywide schools, but close to 100 district G&T schools, usually a classroom within a grade spread out all throughout New York City. And what we saw was a void. There was a void of any organization that allow parents to organize, to share information. And, that was the start of Place NYC. Maud is one of the co-founders along with many other parents. But, it was an opportunity for us to organize, for us to share information, and for us to be able to really take action on what they were going to do to these opportunities of accelerated education.
And I'm going to pipe in one thing there, which is to say that the specialized high school issue in New York was an overarching city issue because kids from all boroughs and from all schools, apply to that school. But there were smaller battles on the same theme, getting rid of accelerated programs, getting rid of honors programs in the name of equity that were happening in different schools and different boroughs. And by forming a group, that started having regular meetings and started to come together, we were able to compare notes and help one another a little bit in what works and what doesn't to fight back against some of those changes, because there's pretty uniform agreement among the parents that came together on, that shared our vision of education, that if we didn't do this, all of those programs would disappear. And so, it's hard to put out 100 little fires all by yourself, but when you start to create a community of parents, you can show up and have a little bit more impact. So I want to move on to what I think is it's really an explosive big issue right now in our school education, which is gender ideology. And I would say that perhaps the biggest change from when any of us, speaking of our panelists, were in school, is really this huge increase in the LGBTQ community visibility. And I will say that, and this is just my personal editorializing, for gay kids and for gay parents, like that's a great thing, that, that visibility. But there's, and I use LGBTQ, even though I some folks use LGB right now and not LGBTQ, because there's a real question going on about how we teach our kids about gender. If we teach our kids about gender, if gender is a spectrum, if this is something that, that we can agree to as parent communities in terms of what our kids should be hearing and learning about. And I think there's probably very complete agreement in terms of treating all kids and all family members, with respect, but there's real genuine difference about what we teach our children around the subject of gender. And I will say that if anyone is interested in this topic, because I think it's super important, that you should follow Candice Jackson on Twitter, because Candice has really writes in this incredibly succinct, smart way about these issues, particularly as they come up in the legal context, how we define sex and how we define gender and what are sex-based rights. And Candice, I'll tell you, I find your Twitter feed almost equal parts reassuring and alarming, because there's a lot of alarming things going on in the law, but I find it very reassuring to read. Your analysis is always so clear and crisp, and that I guess the lawyer in me finds that reassuring. So Candice, I want to ask you, in terms of parents' rights right now, when children question their sex or their gender identity in schools across the country right now, different schools have different protocols that they're following. And perhaps the most alarming is when schools have decided that they are going to keep information from parents to help a child socially transition from one sex to the other, to use a different name. And the reason so many parents find this alarming is both because social transition is often the precursor to hormone treatment or to surgical transitions for kids later on, but also just the fact that a school trying to insert itself between a child and a parent and to keep secrets from a parent, I think is a pretty alarming thing on any range of subjects. If a kid told a school, that they're taking drugs, and the school said, okay, you and I will talk about that secretly between us and not tell your parents about it, I would find that to be equally alarming too. But where we're seeing it come up so much is around trans identity, trans rights issues. Can you tell us what you think parents can do to protect their children most successfully in places where they have a concern about their school not being forthcoming with them?
Yes, this is one of the most alarming and pressing issues. I think the trend of gender ideology has swept across the country. There is probably not a major school district in the country, red state or blue state, that hasn't bought into this. And it's not as though spontaneously and organically a generation of youngsters is suddenly showing up at school, quote, questioning their gender. That's not what's happening. It's the other way around. Schools are working in concert with social media and online influences to inculcate children, to encourage them to ruminate and to be obsessively reflective of their gender, and to box themselves and label themselves and analyze themselves. And they're not doing this from a premise of, here's what the facts are. There's male and there's female, and you are one or the other. Do we need to talk about how you feel about being male or female? Because maybe you feel that because you're a girl, you're not allowed to do stuff. Now that would be a conversation, about gender in terms of, sex-based expectations or stereotypes that is fair to have. We were moving, it seemed like, as a society towards separating away from roles and expectations, and even dress and appearance being so tied to girls do this, boys do that. But because the ideological kind of almost faith-based belief system that everyone has some sort of inner identity that determines what sex they truly are, and not just, you may actually be male even though you were born female. But now, of course, it's exploded into all kinds of invented identities, non-binary and genderqueer and gender fluid, and it goes on and on. And because this has been slipped into schools under the guise of, quote, LGBTQ, it is somehow accepted as part of non-discrimination against homosexuals. When in reality, the way it impacts kids is to expose them to a lot of thought and discussion about sex and sexuality at inappropriate ages and developmental levels, and then confuse them by suggesting to them that sex may not in fact be a fixed material reality at all, and that the right of identity trumps everything. And an unfortunate thing connected to that is that if all of this originally started by trying to be more tolerant of lesbians and gays, gender ideology in the way that sex has become fluid and mutable and a matter of self-identity and self-selection, works against a poor youngster who, may be discovering same-sex attraction, and then all of a sudden looks around and is being told by school and social media that there's no such thing as sex, that you're actually same gender attracted or plural gender attracted. It's all very confusing. And the way that schools are driving a wedge in between students and parents to do all of this is just all the more nefarious. Because if you think about the only reason why a school would adopt a policy of keeping a secret from a parent, the premise behind that, of course, is that parents are abusive. The word for it now is probably transphobic. Parents are evil, parents are bigoted, parents are not going to support their child, parents need to be excluded from their child's psychological and social structure. It makes no sense. It really does not, because we all know that every person working in the K-12 system is a mandatory abuse reporter. So if you really believe that a parent is abusive, you're already obligated to report that. So on the one hand, we've got celebration of identity through LGBTQ. But if it's just a celebration of chosen identity, then what is the big deal about not telling the parents that their child has adopted an identity? Because on the other hand, they get away with the contradiction of, on the other hand, a trans identity or a gender identity may make your child suicidal, and you can't be trusted as a parent to affirm and validate your child's new identity, and that will make them more suicidal. But you can't have it both ways. You can't say this is just a no big deal child figuring out who they are, adopted identity. Why not tell parents? And on the same and on this other hand, say, your child's going to commit suicide and we don't trust you to affirm your child. And so we're going to have your child go by one name at school and call her a boy at school, knowing that she's going to go home and be called a different name and be called a girl at home. It makes no sense at all. And as far as what parents' legal rights are over this is an area that's under development. It just is. There are lawsuits finally starting now challenging schools transitioning children without their parents' knowledge or consent. There are support groups now set up. Parents can finally organize, even anonymously, but participate as a group, as a collective, with new organizations such as GenSpect. I highly recommend checking out their resources. PITT is another resource for parents, parents with inconvenient truths about trans. And these are just springing up because parents are realizing that confronting their schools alone has not so far had much success, but the collective action and strategy in bringing together mental health professionals who are skeptical of this gender movement. We're starting to see lawyers brought into this finally, but it's going to take that kind of action, I think, to roll some of this back.
Candice, what do you think in terms of timeline before the first sort of significant cases come down with regard to, because they are brewing and they are coming into the court system? Do you think it's likely that we're going to see rulings next year?
I'm an optimist by nature, but I can't give you a lot of reason for optimism in the short term with this. Part of it is because on this issue in particular, there really is no there's not much federal mandate going on. This is very state to state. And so I think we are going to see a lot of legal actions have to wind their way through, and it could end up in, contradictory results for a while. This is going to take a while. I don't think we're looking at settling this legally next year.
So yes, I wish it was a slightly more optimistic answer, but I do think that reality makes it all the more important for parents to be able to come together. And I think actually, I will say that we should, GenSpec and PITT, we are two great resources that we're sometimes with the webinars when there are more questions that then we can get to during the webinar, we do send out some additional information afterwards, and I'll put both of those resources and links in those resources. But speaking of legislation, my transitions are all working tonight, so it's great, because the next question that I wanted to ask Mona was about her history in terms of legislation. Mona brings some really great institutional knowledge in terms of New York City parent activism, to the current issues we're facing. And I'll give you an example. In New York City right now, they're introducing this thing called a Desa Screener. And it's this 40-question questionnaire that teachers are supposed to fill out about individual students with all sorts of personal observation and knowledge about kids. And parents had a lot of questions in New York of like, who gets this information? Where is it stored? What's it being used for? Why are you collecting all this personal data and information about our kids? And when I was discussing it with Mona mentioned to me, she said, oh, this sounds just like InBloom, which was well, I'm going to let Mona tell you what InBloom was about and tell you about the efforts of parents previously to stop the sort of mining of our children's personal data through schools. So Mona, can you share with us some of that history?
Yes. So InBloom. InBloom was funded by I call them the lovely Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. You all know, the Gates Foundation, how they tend to think that they know what's best for everybody else. So pretty much with InBloom, our children's information and our information, of course, is collected by our schools, by the school district. But here in New York City, when InBloom was launched, and this was an initiative for school districts to provide, to give InBloom our children's information, their school records, their immunization records, their health records, their IEP records, give them the parents' information. So everything that the school district has on us and our children, the school districts throughout the nation, it wasn't just New York, because everybody jumped on, you know, this idea of working with InBloom and subcontracting and giving them the data so that they could store it on the cloud and so that they could also provide our children's information and our information to third-party contractors and tech companies for them, you know, to create different types of educational software and other things. So, you know, of course, the parents were the last to know. And when we found out that then Commissioner John King and the New York State Education Department were planning to disclose our children's information, all of our children's information, and our information as parents to InBloom, a private corporation, we sued because, you know, this personal information of, you know, related to us and related to our children cannot and should not be disclosed without our explicit consent. And that's what happened with InBloom. And it's a very similar thing that is happening now with Desa. They are cutting parents out of the decision-making process. And, you know, the outcry, the outrage of releasing our children's sensitive information, parent information, you know, New York parents from all over the state, different groups of parents, we all rallied together. I was lead plaintiff in that lawsuit. The parents union was very much involved. Me, I believe I'm a pissed off parent, as some people know. So me, it's the two L's, legislation and litigation. That to me is the only way for our elected officials and school districts to take us seriously. Like if you do not either fight them in the courts when they're doing something that's harmful to you and your children, or you change the law. So what we did was a two-pronged approach. We filed suit, you know, seeking to stop the disclosure of this information because, you know, in New York State, New York privacy law doesn't allow you to disclose information without the person's consent. So we didn't give consent. So why are you going to disclose it to InBloom and whoever else? And then the other thing that we did simultaneously at the same time was we lobbied our legislators. And nobody thought it was possible for us parents to go up against a private, powerful corporation such as InBloom, backed by billionaires. And it wasn't just the Gates Foundation that was behind it. It was a whole bunch of them, all the usual suspects, I call them. So, you know, we did it. We stood up, we pushed back. Like I said, we advocated, we lobbied our legislators. We told them, like, you're disclosing our private information to people that we don't know. There's FERPA. You can't just do that. But, you know, what happened was the blowback, the outrage from parents resulted in the New York State legislature passing a law banning the New York State Education Department from contracting with a third-party vendor and disclosing student and parent information. And once we stopped them in New York, it was a house of cards that just fell. Because then parents in other states also rose up against this disclosure of our children and our personal information without our consent. And then slowly, all of them just started to withdraw and terminate their contracts with InBloom. So we stopped InBloom. And, I always tell parents that if you don't stand up and fight, like, you have to be ready to put yourself on the front lines. And unfortunately, a lot of the time, the front line means you need to litigate, you need to sue them, because then they're going to take you seriously. And then in addition to that, you're going to have access to even more information because you have filed suit. So my advice to parents across the nation is L&L, litigate and legislate. That's what matters.
Mona, that I love hearing that, because it really is a plan of action. And the thing also that I think we've learned here in New York is when you're in the courts or when you're lobbying your local elected officials or your state officials, you got to let the media know about it too, because that is one of the ways to catch the attention. People who are running for office, which I've done, so I know this is true, are really paying attention to what's being written about them in the papers and what is really moving parents, because parents are voters, right? And parents, if you've got so many parents angry that they've gone out and hired a lawyer to say, don't give our kids information away to third parties, that's something that people are going to pay attention to who are running for office. So I agree entirely. And by the way, thank you for doing that, because really that has continued. The fact that our information is private is because of the success of legislation like that. But I also say that it's like, our kids' personal information is tantalizing to groups that want to get their hands on it, right? They're always coming for our kids' information, and schools should really be a place where kids can go and grow up and learn and be kept safe in a very real way. And speaking about sort of mining our kids' personal information and their personal, choices and ideas when they're so young and when they're in an environment that they don't really have a choice about being in. I hear from parents a lot about saying that are hearing about critical race theory, right? And so they say, like, how can I find out if especially sometimes young parents, they say, my kid's going to start kindergarten next year. I want to know, or parents whose kids are in middle school or going to a new high school. I want to know if they're teaching this in my kids' high school, especially now that parents have been locked out because of COVID so much. So in New York, we have this thing called CRSE, which is culturally responsive sustaining education. It's kind of it's basically CRT in a New York package. But the critical race theory infused teachings. It's sort of embedded in the curriculum of a lot of different things. Is something that parents want at a minimum to find out about, to know what's being taught. So we sent to all of you, if you were registered earlier, a letter that we drafted that is seeking information about what's being taught in school and what's being discussed and what's being practiced. And Yiatin, I'm going to go to you to talk about that letter a little bit, because the letter can be used, any communication, whether you call up the school and ask for a meeting with your principal or your kid's teacher, or whether you send them a letter, can be used individually, but it can also be used collectively. And Yiatin, if you could speak to those two different points.
Sure. I think there's two parts. One is, how do parents find out what's going on in the schools? And we get asked that a lot. And luckily with parent communities, whether it's part of PLACE or whether it's part of your own school's Facebook page or your district's, there are ways to keep on top of it. So I break it down into this. One is at the city level. For New York City, we're under mayoral control. It's very much a Department of Education. So stay on top of local media, read what's going on in education on a weekly, monthly basis. Keep your pulse on that. At the school level, take a look at your school's mission statements. This is one of the things that people that want to activate a school do, is they will go in and they want to change what is publicly said about what their school is about. Pay attention to school leadership team elections. In New York, we call them SLTs. So in other states, you may have other forms of school parent leadership, where you get to have a voice in what is being taught in your schools and the after-school programs. Look at who's running, who's getting elected. That will give you a cue as to where the direction of the school's going. Certainly, any school-wide communications and announcements are things that you should be aware of. And they, a school is going in that direction where they want to push this type of, whether CRT, gender ideology, woke, anything, they will deliver it into your child's backpack often. At the classroom level, pay attention to curriculum nights. Look at the syllabus that they're putting out. What is the assigned reading that your child may be asked to look at? These are things that the parents that we're speaking to are sharing across the board. Those are really practical ways, and certainly at your student level, pay attention to the assignments. And sometimes you'll be surprised. I was kind of surprised when I asked my child, "What are you working on?" And she said, "Oh, we're doing something about identity." And I kind of freaked out. I said, "Oh, what are you writing?" And a lot of this is done in the classroom with teachers, and how the teacher may interpret some of those things that may be coming down from central DOE. And some of the teachers will guide that type of interpretation. And luckily for my child, it was about her hopes and dreams. And I'm like, oh, wow, what a relief. But depending on the teacher, those things are really being done at the very, very local level. So those are basically how I've told parents to look out for things that you should be on top of anyway, but it's a little more work than what we used to have to do. But Maud, I think that the second question leads to, how do you use tools like the letter that we shared? One of the things that we've done very effectively in parent advocacy as part of PLACE is to give parents templates, scripts, things that make it easy for them to take action. And a lot of parents will share, I just don't know what to do. What do I say? And what I find useful is to give them something to model after. And we always tell them, read it over, personalize it, make sure that it is a representation of what you're comfortable with communicating. Now, with a lot of the things we do, we do email campaigns to elected officials, and sometimes parents don't even know who their electeds is. But in the case of principals in your school, you certainly already have a direct pipeline into that. And so I would say at the local level, if you're finding that there are things that are being introduced in your school that you have questions about after you've done all these things, talk to other parents in your school. Very often you will find like-minded parents. And when you know someone else that feels the same way, it builds your strength to then now take the next step. And even if you don't, the letter that we provided for you is, it's a list of a lot of things that we've heard from parents that they're concerned about, whether it's, the book lists that they've been assigned, whether it's, what we used to call struggle sessions, like you read about cultural revolution, like, having your kid talk about things that are uncomfortable, making them vulnerable. You'll hear these terms being introduced in classrooms. Let's talk about things. If you're suspecting that's going on, include that. Ask them to share that with you. And the template that we shared includes, all the things we talked about tonight, including gender ideology. And even though everyone on this panel are vocal parent advocates, I will tell you, at least for myself, when it comes to my own child's school, I'm a little softer and gentler, because these are parents that I see, these are administrators and teachers that are taking care of my child. And I would say be optimistic, at least open the door for two-way communication. You may want to start off with emailing your principal and saying, can I come and meet with you? I want to understand some new things I'm hearing about. And the letter is there. Letter's there for you to personalize should you feel that there needs to be a very clear record of your particular objection and your request about being notified. So that is a very real tool that I've been wanting to share with parents that have reached out to me. And I hope what I've just said are things that will help you take steps to address your concerns.
Great. That is great advice. Thank you, Yiatin, for walking us through that. Let us go now. We've just hit the 9 o'clock mark, and I really do want to get to questions. So let us, Gavin, I'm going to lean on you here because I want to check if I have the Q&A questions. Here we go. Oh my goodness. See that? There's a lot of questions there. Oh my goodness. All right. So let me start up at the top. All right. I'm going to read it. I'm just reading it for the first time. It says, I wonder if you could say something about children's rights. It seems to me that the push for children's right isn't really about children so much as the right of the state to intervene on behalf of children. I also know that in some of our local schools, teachers are being instructed to hide a child's gender transition from parents, supposedly on a case-by-case basis. Is there anything we can do about that? We have talked about that a little bit. The second question is also, how can we attend these parents' rights rallies, and where can we find out about this amendment? I wonder if that question was asking about the PPRA, about the protection of pupils' rights amendment. We can send links to the PPRA and to FERPA out with the follow-up, with the recording that will go to everybody.
Yeah, Maud, while you're looking for the next question, I did spot two in there that are super simple to answer, and that is, does the PPRA and FERPA apply to private schools? The answer is yes, if the private school receives federal financial assistance. So a lot of K through 12 truly private schools won't, but some of them do. Some of them, for example, get Department of Agriculture funds for reduced cost lunches or whatever it is. So it depends on, that's the hook for FERPA and PPRA.
Okay, that's great. How about this one? Can you speak to recent school closing in Fairview, Oregon? Reynolds Middle School has the necessary social emotional supports and safety protocols. Oops, I lost my question as I was reading it. Social emotional safety protocols in place to provide a safe learning for all students. Are any of you familiar with the Fairview, Oregon? I mean, what I just read about was a school closing that there's a school, I think it's in Detroit, that's going to a 4-day-a-week school week because they're making Fridays remote. And actually in Virginia, they also did something where they just where there were days off because of holidays. There were 2 or 3 days off in the week, and they said, oh, we'll just make the other days remote, and turned it into it's something that I personally find a little horrifying right now, is that teachers unions and teachers groups have figured out that you can call it school if you call it remote and just not show up for work, like just not go into the classroom. And I, my own personal growing up, listening to the radio as we used to do to hear if there was going to be a snow day, and they would read through all if I explain this to my kids, they'll think I'm 110 years old, but it's like this, the radio would list you all the schools in the district about who was closed, who wasn't, who had a 2-hour delay, but it was a big deal because closing schools was a big deal. And the fact that we now live in a situation where so many kids were out of school for over a year, even long after we knew that they could safely be back in school, has bled into this situation where they say, oh, we're going to do remote schooling on Fridays. Well, that's just closing school, right? Telling kids who may or may not have access to a laptop or any kind of device are just not getting school one day a week less. And I personally find that pretty horrifying. I don't know the Fairview, Oregon case particularly, but that was my rant on pretending that remote school is school. Mona or anything else? Sorry.
There have been a few people who've asked about the opt-out letter and how exactly they should go about using that.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll say that we all had a hand in drafting this with regard to, it's sort of an everything in the kitchen sink kind of letter in terms of the issues. So if your sole issue is concerns about a gender affirming plan in your school, you can just add that in. But I wanted to add in all of the issues that we have heard as parent advocates, including something that I've heard even as recently as today in New York, is the issue of affinity groups, of parents calling me and saying, my daughter was put in an affinity group, which is a segregated classroom setting for where they're dividing kids by race. And what I liked when I read the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment is it really requires this notice to parents. And what I thought is that if we create a letter that people can send to their principal, and you can use this letter exactly as is, or you can modify it, but your schools, and this goes directly to something that Mona said about paying attention to litigation, it's always nice to start off a letter that if you want it to be taken seriously with the fact that you know what your legal rights are. So you cite the statute, and then I promise you there's a lot of principals who'll be like, oh, wait, what is that? And they'll have to go look it up. And the language there is very, as Candice said, it's very expansive about that there's a privacy right for kids and for parents, right? So if your kids are being asked to talk about their privilege, meaning their socioeconomic privilege and their straight privilege and their skin color privilege, that is all covered under race, religion, socioeconomic status, which is all enumerated in that statute. So, you can change it, but what the letter was, the idea was to say to schools like, hold your horses. You don't have the right to ask my kid about all these things without notifying me. And, as Candice also said, a lot of education rights and law resides in the state and not on the federal level. So this, the remedy for what happens if they don't get this right is not so clear. We're entering uncharted territory, but one of the best things to do when you're in uncharted territory is to make a record. So the ideas, both individually, you could use this letter to try to open a conversation. If you're being blown off by your school, you can say, oh, hey, I actually know what my rights are and I want to be notified if you're having this kind of conversation with my kid. But the other good thing, the thing that I like about parents using letters like this is if enough of us do it, that becomes something that a school or a district has to respond to, right? Because one parent is easier to blow off than 25% of the parents saying, I'd like notification if this is going on, if affinity groups are happening in my kid's classroom, or if, let's see, what else did we put in there? Presenting things that are in a fact-based way, whether it's gender ideology or racial discussions, right? If kids are reading White Fragility and it's all white people are racist, well, are they being taught that as something that's true? Or are they being asked to discuss that along with other books or other ideas that challenge those ideas? Because those are very different things. And you have a right as a parent, I think we all have rights as parents to ask if that's being done in the school and to have a conversation about it. Gavin, you're on top of the questions for me. So tell me what other questions we should get to.
Mona or anyone else, what do you say to those proponents of removing SRO who say that the presence of SROs is traumatizing to BIPOC students, making it hard/impossible for students to learn?
It's very interesting to me that the people that make those assertions that say, for example, having a metal detector at a high school is harmful to students, it's traumatizing. even a metal detector is going to put these students on the school to prison pipeline. It makes the students feel like they're in prison. You know, that's what we hear here in New York City. And, you know, my response to that is, if I want to go to City Hall, I go through security. I go through a metal detector. If I want to go to the Department of Education, I go through security, I go through a metal detector, I show ID. If, you know, any municipal agency or state agency here in New York City, when we go into those buildings, we have to go through metal detectors. So there's nothing traumatizing about that. That's not going to put our children on the school to prison pipeline or traumatize them. You know, the reason for the school to prison pipeline in New York City and in many of these other communities is the fact that these children are not being educated. That is the cause of the school to prison pipeline. A supermajority of children, and I'm speaking for New York City, not being proficient, not being able to read, write, or do math at grade level, that is the cause of the school to prison pipeline. So as the mother of a 13-year-old, when he goes to high school next year, you know what? One of the things that I look at, once I look at the scores, Regents exam scores, proficiency rates, then I look to see if it's a scanning school, because I want my son to attend a scanning school, because these children bring weapons to school. And it's just as it is here in New York City, it's the same in other parts of the country. If we really want to protect our children, we will have, whether it's the school resource officers or in New York City school safety agents, we need them in our schools. That's what's going to protect our children. That's what's going to protect, what do they call the BIPOC, whatever it is, all these terms. It's like, I get confused. I'm just like, but that's what's going to protect our children. We need these officers, whether they're armed or unarmed. I am fine with it. We need them in our schools to protect our children. That's what matters to me. Protecting our children, ensuring they're safe, not playing political football with our children's lives.
Hear, hear. Candice, there's two questions I'm going to combine and direct them towards you. The first is, can transgender education awareness be considered sex ed? If so, are rights parents have around sex ed, and are there rights parents have around sex ed in schools, public and private? And the second question was, is there any litigation in the pipeline that goes after schools for practicing counseling or medicine without a license as it relates to radical gender ideology?
Both great questions. Taking the second one first, there's that theory is going around. I am not certain whether it's actually been raised in a lawsuit yet, but the groundwork is definitely being laid. There have been some good friend of the court briefs filed by therapists and others in the mental health profession, and you know, in the kind of sexology, sociology realm, that are laying the groundwork for recognizing that social transition is in and of itself a very serious psychological intervention into a child's psyche, into their life. And so that does lay the groundwork for exactly that theory. So I do think we will see that raised more and more. Schools, even the counselors in them, even the mental health professionals in them are not qualified to be doing what they're doing. And in terms of whether transgender can constitute sex ed, that's an interesting question as well. The rights of parents around sex ed to begin with are going to be state determined. Right now, I'm seeing in California the potential to for there to be pretty much a conflict between different sections of our state education code. On the one hand, we do give parents specific rights in terms of opting out of sex ed, human sexuality, that kind of thing. On the other hand, we have a newer part of the education code that that carves out specifically anything that touches on lesbian, gay, transgender issues, that you can't opt out of that. And so what happens when the school blends those two, right? Which is exactly what's going on. So I think yet again, that's a legal issue that is buried just beneath the surface and is going to have to be exposed here pretty soon.
And then I will say, we're going to continue on the same topic, which tells you that this is a big topic among parents right now. With regard to uncovering school programs that attempt to inculcate gender nonconformity and hide students who declare themselves non-binary, what is a good topic for public records requests that we can submit to identify such programs and policies? We notice that school districts are very evasive when responding to PRRs in general, and questions about LGBTQ indoctrination in particular.
That is also a good question. It is a good, strong Public Records Act request or Freedom of Information Act request. The state versions of those would probably make a very good template. Like Yiatin was talking about, that templates like that would be really valuable. Yes, there may be some specific differences among state laws, but the overall thrust of it is, you need to be detailed enough so that you're not overburdening the school to go look for huge volumes of records. And it's also true that schools are doing everything they can intentionally and deliberately right now to avoid laws like FERPA and to avoid having to respond to Public Records Act requests. So it is possible that you're going to have to exercise your rights under Public Records Act to actually take the school to court.
Right. I will say that with, two things. One, you do have to keep the FOIL requests narrow, and part of the way you can do that is narrowing in time. These things are pretty recent. You're not asking them for records for the last 10 years, because 10 years ago, nobody was trying to hide your kid's social transitioning. So the time you can narrow things in time is helpful. The other thing is, I was just going to tell you what the other thing was, and now I can't remember.
Use a lot of keywords, which means, don't do it, right after you've eaten a meal, but go ahead and immerse yourself in the craziness and the linguistics and the terminology around queer theory and gender ideology, because it changes frequently. But if you use keywords in your public records requests, you'll have a better chance of the school being able to just pop the search terms in and have no excuse for not turning up records for you.
That is very true. And that it reminds me of the other thing I was going to say, which is that what I have seen and heard from people is that sometimes the LGBTQ stuff that is coming in is not coming in under sex education. It's coming in under anti-bullying programs.
That's right.
So anti-bullying, what parent is gonna object to anti-bullying? We all don't, no one wants their kids to be bullied or be a bully. And so anti-bullying programs is something to keep your eyes on. It makes us all sound kind of paranoid, but it's like anti-bullying in a very thoughtful, general way is a good thing. I mean, it's actually very hard to do, to teach kids how to not be a bully or how to stand up to a bully. But it is the umbrella kind of language that is used sometimes to put much more radical ideas in front of kids, because you can introduce a lot of the gender spectrum ideas in what you're calling an anti-bullying program. So I'll just throw that out there. Someone did ask about Detroit, but we already talked about Detroit. And this is a question to Mona. Sorry, Gavin, you have
I had two questions that I was
okay, go ahead.
out there.
Go,
I was going to take a page out of your book, do the two questions in one. So someone's wondering, how do you address the school board that says CRT is not in the school, but parents know that it is? And more generally, another question was wondering the best way to be a more effective school board member combating these issues.
Yiatin, since you've been on a school board very recently, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, well, I think all of us have been very involved parents. So I think the first question is, what do you do if the school board or your school denies that? I think you need to be specific. Talking to people about CRT and reading about how people take CRT, what it is, you have to be very specific. What is in the mind of how you define CRT is very different than the next person. And people use it very loosely, and I would say it's kind of woke. And again, I think you need to get to the specifics. You can say, I don't like the idea that you are separating our students by race, right? Don't say, actually, I would say, don't just use the word CRT. No one knows really what you're talking about. And it's a very triggering type of term, and depending on who you're talking to. So be specific. Or there's a book that my child is being assigned to read. I'm really concerned. I've heard from other parents. I've looked at the book. So as specific as you can get. When our children were being taught over Zoom, some of the parents had shared screen grabs of PowerPoint presentations that were shared in the classroom with their students. And so I would say any type of evidence, receipts, specificity are ways to talk about it. And, you know, I don't like the fact that you are making my child who is white feel like they've done something wrong based on just their skin color. I think you have to speak in those terms. And the more that you can get in terms of notices, screen grabs, assignments, the better off you are in terms of having those conversations. And while we talk about CRT and it's a catchphrase in media, it's probably one that I would stay away from just using very loosely. So that's my advice on that piece of it. Remind me the second part of it.
The other part was, how do you address a school board that says, sorry, my apologies. That was the section you talked about, correct?
Yes.
They were wondering just more generally as a school board member, how they can advocate.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a school board member, there are just ways in which you interact, but how do you as a parent get involved with school boards? First of all, know that there are meetings. They're usually posted on websites and on any social media accounts. Be on their email list so you get notifications of when these meetings are happening. Very often the agenda and the topics and the resolutions that they want to discuss are also shared in these communications. And there are also ways in which you can sign up and speak publicly at all of these. In New York, these are public meetings, they're open meetings. And so any parent, whether or not you live in that school district, but for most people, you know, they're getting involved in their specific school district school board, sign up to speak. There's usually a time limit. So be prepared to, you know, speak concisely and get your point across. And if you can't make it, there's usually an email address. You should certainly communicate to the school board by email if you know, you're unable to attend the event. And even more powerful, and we talk about this a lot in parent advocacy, is to get other parents who have the same question and the same concern to also show up. So one parent, they can kind of like, oh, you know, random parent ignore. But if you can get a group of parents, whether it's 3 of you, 5 of you, or a dozen of you, the more people that show up and say the same thing, the more severity and the more attention you will get to such an issue. So I hope that was helpful.
Someone is asking a question on the opting out. The FERPA and PPRA say it is illegal to not let parents opt out of these issues. Is this true even in private schools? We were refused the ability to opt out and had to leave the private school over it.
Yeah, so the private school, it would only apply if they receive federal funding. Generally, though, FERPA isn't an opt-out situation. It's a right to access records and correct factual misstatements in your students' records. PPRA is granting a right to be notified and have the opportunity to opt out of any of these surveys or evaluations of these sensitive topics. I should, I think Maud's on mute, but I'll quickly add too that unfortunately, both PPRA and FERPA do not have a private right of action built into the statutes, which means you cannot sue in court. You can't take your school to court over violations of those statutes. You have to file a complaint with the education department.
We don't have to tell the principals that just yet, though.
No, you don't have to let them know that. That's right.
I'm going to try to get to two more questions. And we've got a couple of great questions here, but I thought this was interesting. My kid's Catholic Jesuit high school is teaching implicit bias, microaggressions, systemic racism, and the requirement to perform anti-racism, otherwise you're a racist. And they're teaching this as part of social justice. It seems to have even less rights being in private school and have basically been threatened to shut up or get out. My kids are third generation at this school. How do Catholics reclaim the term social justice from the current narrative and go back to the gospel values of individual dignity instead of group membership? I hear and respect the fact that it's a Catholic school and Catholic question, but I think the question applies to people more broadly. I think I've heard from parents all outside of the parochial setting that have that same concern about their kids being treated as a representative member of a racial group instead of as an individual human being with their individual dignity. Does anyone want to address that? It's the really hard question. I don't have a great answer, but go ahead.
It is a hard one. It's a hard one from my viewpoint with experience trying to, be in charge of enforcing civil rights laws, non-discrimination laws. It comes up a lot conceptually. Where is that line? Where are we trying to go as a society, drawing a line between honoring individuality and individual rights and seeing past or beyond or aside from group characteristics, and yet recognizing a history of issues around characteristics and with groups having equal access to things. And so there's a line there somewhere. And I think we were on a much better track for figuring that out before we went woke, which to a lot of people, whatever that means, it seems to mean, throwing out any idea of individuality and more any idea of appeal to even logic or rationality. Everything objective is thrown out and it all becomes subjective.
And I'll add one thing that question, made me think of is the fact that we spend a lot of time, I certainly spend a lot of time thinking about broader activism, as Mona has talked about in terms of legislation and litigators, more personal level activism, what our legal rights are. And, but sometimes I think one of the things we have to do as parents is just talk to our kids about what's going on in their classroom, because we're not going to fix all the things that are wrong during our kids' journey through, I have, my eldest is a 10th grader and my youngest is in kindergarten. So I have a little lead time on the kindergartner to try to fix things. And my eldest actually got an elementary school education that was somewhat free of some of the woke stuff that has picked up steam in the last few years, but he's getting it full tilt in high school. So what I try to do sometimes is really talk to them about it and make sure they're hearing other things. I drive 2 out of 4 of my kids to school in the morning, and anyone's free to laugh at me if they want, but Ben Shapiro was on the Joe Rogan podcast and they were talking about a bunch of things that our kids will never hear in school. And they were having an interesting conversation. And so I put it on in the car in the morning because I also have a 13-year-old who gets tons of woke information through her school all the time. And, she'll disagree or say, but Mom, but what about this? And what about that? I'm fine with disagreement because she's taking in information that she's not getting elsewhere. And I think that is, the rebel in me wants to make sure, there's nothing wrong with being contrarian. And when your kids are getting so inculcated and indoctrinated and just fed a steady stream of super woke narrative, it's just important to make sure, for me, to make sure that they hear other ideas, and they don't have to accept them right away. And I'm not saying you have to think like this or you have to accept that, because that doesn't work with teenagers, but really, you know, it's like putting stuff out there that they can grab onto, or that they can just have their ideas open to something else, is really important too. Because all of these issues where we are, as parents, as activists, as litigators, as lawyers, you know, we can really try to change the system, and we need to, because there are things going wrong and we need to change them. But we also are parents, so many of us, that need to also just make sure we're helping our kids navigate these really tricky topics. And so that's something that, you know, as parents, we can help each other out with to some extent, I think. Here's, you know, I don't want to go too far over time, so I'm going to just go to everybody for some final thoughts before we wrap it up. And we will send out a follow-up information with a letter, with the links that we've promised. And we'll take a quick, Gavin, we can hold on to the questions, right? For any questions that we didn't get to.
Apologies. Yeah, we will have a copy of the Q&A, so we can.
Great.
Yeah, I will contact people who didn't get their question answered live.
Okay, fantastic. And so Yiatin, you want to give us your final thoughts?
Sure. Look, you'll be amazed at what one voice can do in terms of changes. Stepping into education advocacy has been very empowering. And I would say to parents, start small. I mean, it is maybe just a conversation with your principal. Be active, be present for some of those meetings in school, and you know, don't be afraid to speak your mind. You'll be surprised how many more parents are just like you, and they're grateful that you said the first time. So that's my leaving comment.
Fantastic. Mona, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would just add to what Yiatin has said. You have to get involved. Attend that school board meeting. If I don't know how it is in the rest of the country, but if there's something similar to what we have, our school leadership team meetings, attend those meetings. Be present, ask questions, because no matter what, as the parent, the onus is on you to ensure that your child is getting the education that they deserve. The onus is on you to protect your child. So, you know, I know many times it's always easy to blame the school or blame the school district, but I think as parents, we need to hold each other accountable as well. The other thing that I want to just add, and it's just kind of a little bit off topic. I know we talked about, you know, parents need to opt out. In my experience here in New York City, when they say, you know, parents have the option to opt out of something, let me tell you, parents don't even get that opt out letter or notice. I think that we need to push that it's that parents have to opt in, that it's automatically not going to happen unless the parents opt into whatever it is. Because opt out, it gives them an excuse, and then they can always say, well, they sent out the notice. If your child didn't give it to you, and they put the responsibility on the child. And as parents, we'll be completely unaware that something really serious was sent out and that we need to pay attention to it. So I think that parents need to push more that when it comes to these types of things with the school and the school district, no, we want to opt in. We shouldn't have to tell you that we want to opt out. Send us that same notice, but say, you know, give us the option that we opt in, not that we opt out. And that way I can tell you, we'll start getting all of those notices.
I like that, Mona. Candice, we'll go to you for the last word.
leave you with, do not fall into the trap anymore, if you ever have, of assuming that you are sending your kids to be educated by experts. If something sounds crazy to you, if it probably is, and it is not okay anymore to just assume, well, they must know what they're talking about. They've gone to teacher college. They're bringing in all these outside experts. They know what they're talking about. They do not know what they're talking about. Nobody knows what they are talking about with some of this insanity. So do not think yourself any less an expert on material reality and basic logic than any educator you will be talking to and discussing things with in your child's school.
That is an absolutely fantastic final word. I want to say thank you so much, Gavin. Thank you for leading us through the Q&A. Yiatin, Mona, and Candice, thank you so very much. And to all of you who signed on or who are watching this at a later date, thank you so much. And please, make sure that you're signed up on the Fair for All website so that you get future information. We host these webinars on topics that are relevant to all of these issues that we discussed tonight. And we will be sending you in for, links to this and to future events that we have coming up. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, and good night.